In May of 1527, an army of 20,000 men swarmed over the walls of Rome. They were supposed to be soldiers of the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, the most powerful Christian monarch in the world. But they hadn't been paid in months. They were hungry, angry, and completely out of control. Their commander had been killed in the initial assault, shot through the head while leading a charge. Now there was no one to restrain them. What followed was one of the most horrific atrocities in European history. For 8 days, the Imperial Army, a mix of Spanish veterans, German Landsknechts, and Italian mercenaries, systematically destroyed the Eternal City. They murdered priests on the altars of churches. They raped nuns in their convents. They tortured wealthy citizens to reveal hidden treasures. They used the Sistine Chapel as a stable for their horses. They played football with the skulls of saints. The death toll is impossible to calculate precisely, but estimates suggest that between 6,000 and 12,000 Romans were killed. Tens of thousands more fled. The population of Rome collapsed from approximately 55,000 to less than 10,000. The city that had been the center of the Renaissance, the city of Michelangelo and Raphael, of popes who patronized the greatest artists in history, was reduced to a smoking ruin. Pope Clement VII watched from Castel Sant'Angelo, the fortress where he had taken refuge. He could see the fires, hear the screams. The Vicar of Christ was a prisoner in his own city, helpless to protect his flock. The sack of Rome shocked all of Europe. It seemed like the end of something, the end of Italian independence, the end of the Renaissance, perhaps the end of civilization itself. But the sack was not the beginning of Italy's nightmare. It was merely the climax. For 33 years before that terrible May, the great powers of Europe had been using Italy as a battleground. French kings and Spanish kings and Holy Roman emperors had marched their armies up and down the peninsula, fighting over territories, fighting over prestige, fighting sometimes for no clear reason at all. The Italian wars lasted from 1494 to 1559-65, years of intermittent conflict that killed hundreds of thousands, bankrupted multiple kingdoms, and ended the political independence that Italian states had enjoyed for centuries. This is the story of how the Garden of Europe became a graveyard. To understand why Italy became the cockpit of European warfare, you need to understand what Italy was in the 15th century. It was not a nation. The concept of Italy as a unified country wouldn't exist for another 400 years. Instead, the Italian peninsula was divided into a patchwork of independent states, each with its own government, its own army, and its own ambitions. In the north was the Duchy of Milan, one of the wealthiest territories in Europe, controlling the rich agricultural lands of the Po Valley and the trade routes across the Alps. Milan was ruled by the Sforza family condottieri, mercenary captains who had seized power through military skill and political cunning. To the east was the Republic of Venice, the great maritime power that dominated trade with the East. Venice was fabulously wealthy, its merchants dealing in spices, silk, and slaves. The Venetians had built an empire that stretched from the lagoon to Cyprus, from the Adriatic coast to the mountains of the mainland. In central Italy was the Republic of Florence, the banking capital of Europe, home to the Medici family whose financial network stretched across the continent. Florence was the heart of the Renaissance, the city of Leonardo da Vinci, of Botticelli, of Brunelleschi's dome. Surrounding Florence were smaller states, Siena, Lucca, Ferrara, Mantua. Each was independent, each was proud, each was perpetually scheming against its neighbors. In the center of the peninsula lay the Papal States, ruled by the Pope in his dual capacity as spiritual leader of Christendom and temporal lord of central Italy. The Renaissance popes were not spiritual figures in any meaningful sense. They were Italian princes who happened to wear religious vestments, as concerned with territorial expansion as with saving souls. And in the south was the Kingdom of Naples, the largest Italian state by territory, controlling everything below Rome, including the island of Sicily. Naples had been fought over for centuries, passing from Norman to German to French to Spanish hands. These Italian states were wealthy, cultured, and sophisticated. They had developed advanced techniques of diplomacy, pioneering the use of resident ambassadors. They had created banking systems that financed commerce across Europe. They had patronized artists and scholars who produced some of the greatest works in human history. But they had one fatal weakness: they were small. The Italian states had developed a system of balance of power politics that kept any single state from dominating the peninsula. When one state grew too powerful, the others would ally against it. When a conflict threatened to spiral out of control, diplomats would intervene to negotiate a settlement. The Peace of Lodi in 1454 had formalized this system, creating a framework of mutual defense that preserved Italian independence. The system worked as long as no outside power was strong enough or interested enough to upset the balance. By the late 15th century, that condition no longer held. France had emerged from the 100 Years' War unified and powerful. The English had been expelled, the great nobles had been tamed, and the French king commanded resources that dwarfed anything the Italian states could muster. Spain was being unified through the marriage of Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile. The conquest of Granada in 1492, the same year Columbus sailed, completed the Christian reconquest of Iberia. Spain was becoming a great power. The Holy Roman Empire, though fragmented and poorly organized, still claimed sovereignty over much of northern Italy. The emperor might not be able to enforce that claim consistently, but it provided a legal pretext for intervention. And all of these powers had claims to Italian territories. The French kings claimed Naples through a complicated inheritance from the House of Anjou. The Spanish kings of Aragon had actually ruled Naples until it was seized by a rival branch of the family. The emperor claimed Milan as an imperial fief. Italy was like a wealthy house with unlocked doors, surrounded by powerful neighbors who had convinced themselves they had legal rights to the property. All they needed was an invitation. The invitation came from Ludovico Sforza, Duke of Milan. Ludovico, known as Il Moro, the Moor, because of his dark complexion, was one of the most brilliant and ruthless rulers of his age. He had seized control of Milan by deposing his nephew, the legitimate duke, and ruled through a combination of charm, patronage, and intimidation. His court was magnificent. Leonardo da Vinci worked in Milan during these years, creating the Last Supper and designing war machines and engineering marvels. Ludovico patronized artists, architects, and scholars. He saw himself as a Renaissance prince, a cultivator of beauty and learning. He was also playing a dangerous game. In 1494, Ludovico faced a problem. King Ferrante of Naples had died, and Ferrante's grandson Alfonso was pressing claims to Milan. Alfonso was allied with Pope Alexander VI, the notorious Borgia Pope, and with Florence. Ludovico was increasingly isolated. His solution was catastrophic. He invited the King of France to invade Italy. Charles VIII of France was 24 years old, ambitious, and dreaming of glory. He had inherited the French claim to Naples and had been thinking about an Italian expedition for years. Ludovico's invitation was exactly what he was waiting for. In September 1494, Charles VIII crossed the Alps with an army of 25,000 men. It was the largest French army to enter Italy in centuries, well-equipped, well-supplied, and accompanied by the most advanced artillery in Europe. The French bronze cannons were a revolutionary weapon. Previous siege guns had been cumbersome, inaccurate, and fragile. The French guns were lighter, more mobile, and far more powerful. They could batter down medieval walls that had stood for centuries. No one in Italy was prepared for what was coming. The French march through Italy was a demonstration of overwhelming force. Charles VIII crossed the Alps, descended into Lombardy, and was welcomed by Ludovico Sforza in Milan. The Italian states, which had been squabbling among themselves as usual, suddenly realized that they faced a common threat, but it was too late to organize resistance. Florence was the first major test. The city was ruled by Piero de' Medici, son of the great Lorenzo, but Piero lacked his father's political skills. When Charles VIII approached Florence, Piero panicked. He rode out to meet the French king and surrendered everything: the key fortresses, the city's treasury, anything Charles demanded. The Florentines were outraged. They expelled Piero and restored the Republic. The Medici, who had dominated Florence for 60 years, were driven into exile. Charles VIII entered Florence in triumph, but he found a city in chaos. A Dominican friar named Girolamo Savonarola had emerged as the dominant voice, preaching apocalyptic sermons that blamed Italy's misfortunes on moral corruption. He denounced the Renaissance, its art, its paganism, its pursuit of worldly beauty as sins that had brought God's wrath upon Italy. The French army, Savonarola proclaimed, was the scourge of God, sent to punish a wicked people. Charles VIII was unnerved by the fervor of Savonarola's followers. He hurried on toward Naples. The kingdom of Naples collapsed almost without a fight. King Alfonso II abdicated in favor of his son, Ferrantino, and fled to Sicily. Ferrantino tried to organize resistance, but his nobles deserted him, his mercenaries switched sides, and his people showed no enthusiasm for fighting. In February 1495, Charles VIII entered Naples in triumph. He had conquered a kingdom in less than 5 months, almost without drawing a sword. The Italian states had proven incapable of defending themselves. French power seemed irresistible. Charles VIII was intoxicated by his success. He dressed himself in the robes of a Byzantine emperor, styling himself as the heir of the Eastern Roman Empire. He talked of crusading to Constantinople, of reconquering Jerusalem, of achieving glories that would eclipse Alexander the Great. But he had made a critical mistake. While Charles was distracted by his dreams of empire, the Italian states were forming an alliance against him. Venice, Milan, the Pope, the Holy Roman Emperor, and Spain all joined forces in the League of Venice. Their motives varied. Venice feared French power in Italy. Milan regretted having invited the French in the first place. Spain wanted Naples for itself, but they shared a common goal: expel the French. Charles VIII suddenly realized that he was trapped. His army was deep in southern Italy, hundreds of miles from France. The League was gathering forces to cut off his retreat. In July 1495, Charles began the long march home. The Battle of Fornovo, fought on July 6, 1495, was the first major pitched battle of the Italian Wars. The League had assembled an army of perhaps 30,000 men: Venetians, Milanese, and others to block the French retreat through the Apennines. Charles had only about 10,000 men, but they included the elite of French chivalry and the artillery that had conquered Naples. The battle was confused and bloody. Both sides claimed victory afterward. The League captured the French baggage train, including an enormous amount of treasure that Charles had looted from Naples. The French broke through and continued their retreat. In military terms, it was probably a draw. In strategic terms, it was a French defeat. Charles VIII got out of Italy alive, but he lost Naples within months. The kingdom was recaptured by Ferrantino with Spanish help. The first French invasion had achieved nothing permanent. Charles VIII died in 1498, hitting his head on a door frame at his chateau and succumbing to the injury. He was 27 years old. But the damage was done. The Italian wars had begun. The myth of Italian military weakness had been established, and every great power in Europe had learned that Italy was vulnerable. They would all come back for more. Charles VIII's successor, Louis XII, came back almost immediately. Louis had his own claims to Italian territory, not just Naples, but Milan itself. His grandmother had been a Visconti, the family that had ruled Milan before the Sforza. By dynastic logic, Louis was the legitimate Duke of Milan. Ludovico Sforza, who had invited the French into Italy in the first place, now found himself the target. In 1499, Louis XII invaded. The French army was even larger than Charles VIII's had been, perhaps 50,000 men. And this time, they were not just passing through on the way to Naples. They were coming for Milan. Ludovico's subjects had no loyalty to him. His mercenary armies melted away, his fortresses surrendered. The French entered Milan almost unopposed. Ludovico fled to Germany, gathered an army of Swiss mercenaries, and tried to recapture his duchy. He almost succeeded. The people of Milan rose against the French, and Ludovico briefly returned to his capital. But the Swiss betrayed him. At the Battle of Novara in April 1500, the Swiss in Ludovico's army refused to fight the Swiss in the French army. Ludovico was captured, disguised as a common soldier, trying to escape in the midst of his departing mercenaries. He spent the remaining 8 years of his life as a prisoner in France. The brilliant Renaissance prince died in a dungeon, far from the court he had made glorious. His fall was a lesson in the dangers of inviting foreign armies into your homeland. Ludovico had thought he could use the French as a tool. Instead, they had used him. With Milan secure, Louis XII turned his attention to Naples. This time, he had a partner, Spain. Ferdinand of Aragon, one of the most cynical and effective rulers in European history, proposed a deal. France and Spain would conquer Naples together and divide it between them. Louis would get the northern portion, Ferdinand the southern. It was a transparent setup for a double cross, and Louis walked right into it. The Franco-Spanish army conquered Naples easily in 1501. The partition was agreed. And then, almost immediately, the two allies began fighting over the division. The partition had been vaguely defined. Disputes arose over which territories belonged to which side. The disputes escalated into skirmishes, and the skirmishes into open war. Spain had a crucial advantage. Gonzalo Fernández de Córdoba, known to history as the Great Captain, Gonzalo was one of the outstanding military commanders of his age, perhaps of any age. He had learned his trade fighting the Moors in Granada. He had studied the failures of previous armies and developed new tactics to address them. Most importantly, he understood the changing nature of warfare. The old model of heavy cavalry charges was becoming obsolete. Improved firearms, professional pike formations, and field fortifications were making the armored knight less and less relevant. Gonzalo built an army around infantry arquebusiers with firearms, pikemen with long spears trained to work together in coordinated formations. This was the beginning of the famous Spanish tercios, the infantry formations that would dominate European battlefields for the next century and a half. At the Battle of Cerignola in April 1503, Gonzalo demonstrated his new tactics. The French army, confident in their traditional cavalry superiority, attacked the Spanish position. Gonzalo had fortified his line with a ditch and an earthen rampart. His arquebusiers opened fire from behind these defenses. The French cavalry charge collapsed in blood and confusion. The Duke of Nemours, the French commander, was killed. The French army was routed. Cerignola was the first major battle in history to be decided primarily by gunpowder weapons. The future of warfare was visible on that Italian field. Gonzalo followed up his victory with another at the Galiano River in December 1503. The French retreated from Naples entirely. By 1504, the Kingdom of Naples was entirely in Spanish hands. It would remain Spanish for the next 200 years. Louis XII had lost Naples. He had lost his alliance with Spain. He had spent enormous resources and thousands of lives for nothing. But he still held Milan, and he was determined to keep it. The wars continued. The next phase of the Italian wars involved an even more complicated web of alliances and betrayals. In 1508, Pope Julius II organized the League of Cambrai, an alliance of France, Spain, the Empire, and the papacy against Venice. The Venetians had been expanding on the Italian mainland, absorbing territories that the Pope and the Emperor considered rightfully theirs. The League's war against Venice was brutal and nearly successful. At the Battle of Agnadello in May 1509, the French shattered the Venetian army. Venice lost nearly all of its mainland possessions in a matter of weeks, but Venice survived. The Republic made peace with the Pope, surrendering claims to papal territories, and bought off other enemies. The coalition began to fragment, and then Julius II pulled off one of the most dramatic reversals in diplomatic history. Having used the French to defeat Venice, he now turned against them. He formed a new alliance, the Holy League, bringing together Spain, Venice, the Empire, and eventually England against France. The stated goal was to expel the barbarians from Italy. The real goal was to expel the French and establish papal dominance over the peninsula. Julius II was 70 years old, and he personally led troops into battle, besieging cities and rallying soldiers. He was a pope who looked far more comfortable in armor than in vestments. Michelangelo reportedly based his famous sculpture of Moses on Julius Fierce, commanding, terrifying. The French were driven out of Milan in 1512. The Sforza were briefly restored. The Medici were restored to Florence also with papal help. Italy seemed to be returning to its pre-1494 configuration, but this was an illusion. The great powers had tasted Italian wealth and Italian vulnerability. They would not stop coming. The French were not finished with Italy. In 1515, a new king came to the French throne. Francis I, he was 20 years old, tall, athletic, cultured, and burning with ambition. He had grown up hearing stories of Italian glory, of Charles VIII's triumphant entry into Naples, of the wealth and beauty of the peninsula, of the chivalric deeds that awaited a bold king. Francis wanted his own Italian adventure. Within months of his coronation, he gathered the largest French army, yet perhaps 40,000 men, including thousands of German Landsknecht mercenaries and the best artillery in Europe. He led them across the Alps by a route so difficult that his enemies believed it impassable. The Swiss held Milan for the Sforza Duke. They were considered the finest infantry in Europe, disciplined pikemen whose squares had broken every army sent against them for a generation. They were confident they could defeat the French, as they had defeated Louis XII just 3 years earlier. They were wrong. The Battle of Marignano, fought on September 13th to 14th, 1515, was the bloodiest battle of the Italian wars up to that point. It lasted 2 days, an almost unprecedented duration for a Renaissance battle. The French and the Swiss hammered each other in desperate fighting that continued into the night, illuminated by the moon and by burning buildings. Francis I fought in the thick of it, leading cavalry charges, rallying wavering troops, proving himself a warrior king in the tradition of his medieval ancestors. At one point, he was unhorsed and nearly killed. He fought on. The French artillery was decisive. The Swiss pike squares, densely packed, were perfect targets for cannon fire. Each cannonball that struck home tore bloody lanes through the Swiss ranks. When the sun rose on the second day, Venetian reinforcements arrived to support the French. The Swiss, exhausted and reduced by terrible casualties, finally retreated. Between 8 and 15,000 Swiss died at Marignano. French losses were also severe, perhaps 5,000 dead. It was a mutual slaughter, but the French held the field. Francis I had conquered Milan. The battle had another consequence. It broke Swiss confidence. The Swiss Confederation, shaken by the carnage, would never again play a major role in European power politics. They retreated into their mountains and eventually adopted the policy of neutrality that they maintain to this day. Francis I became the hero of Christendom, the warrior king who had defeated the invincible Swiss. He met with Pope Leo X, the Medici Pope, who had succeeded the ferocious Julius II, and negotiated the Concordat of Bologna, which gave France significant control over the French Church. At 21, Francis was at the height of his power. But a new rival was emerging, a rival who would become his nemesis for the next 3 decades. Charles of Habsburg inherited the world. When his grandfather Ferdinand of Aragon died in 1516, Charles inherited Spain, Naples, Sicily, and the vast Spanish possessions in the New World, the Americas that Columbus had discovered and the conquistadors were busily conquering. When his other grandfather, Emperor Maximilian, died in 1519, Charles was elected Holy Roman Emperor, giving him sovereignty over Germany, Austria, the Netherlands, and much of Central Europe. Charles V, as he now styled himself, ruled more territory than any European monarch since Charlemagne. His empire stretched from Peru to the Philippines, from the Baltic to the Mediterranean. In my realm, he could truthfully say the sun never sets. He was also utterly humorless, rigidly pious, and plagued by a genetic jaw deformity that made it difficult for him to eat or speak clearly. He was not charming like Francis. He was not dashing or romantic. But he was relentless, methodical, and absolutely committed to maintaining his vast inheritance. Charles and Francis were natural enemies. Their territories surrounded each other. The Habsburgs held the Netherlands to France's north, Spain to its south, and the Empire to its east. France was encircled. Any conflict between them would be existential, and they both wanted Italy. The rivalry between Francis I and Charles V dominated European politics for a generation. They were almost exactly the same age. Charles was 6 years younger, and they would spend their adult lives fighting each other. Their personal hatred was genuine and bitter. They exchanged insults through diplomatic channels. They challenged each other to single combat challenges that were never actually carried out, but that expressed the intensity of their enmity. The Italian peninsula was the primary theater of their conflict. Francis held Milan, Charles held Naples and claimed Milan as an imperial fief. The Pope, the Venetians, and the smaller Italian states were caught between them, trying desperately to balance the two giants against each other. The first round went to Charles. In 1521, imperial and papal forces attacked French-held Milan. The French were driven out. The Sforzaduke was restored again under imperial protection. Francis's Italian conquests evaporated almost as quickly as they had been won. Francis responded by invading again and again. The pattern of the early Italian wars repeated itself. French armies crossed the Alps, won initial successes, and then were pushed back by coalitions of their enemies. In 1524, Francis led another major invasion. He recaptured Milan and pushed south, besieging the city of Pavia. It was a mistake. The Battle of Pavia, fought on February 24, 1525, was a catastrophe for France. Francis had surrounded the city, but an imperial relief army arrived before Pavia fell. The French were caught between the city garrison and the relieving force. In the confused fighting that followed, the French army was destroyed. The French cavalry, the pride of the realm, charged into a killing ground. Imperial arquebusiers and pikemen cut them to pieces. The Swiss mercenaries in French service were surrounded and massacred, and Francis I himself was captured. The King of France, the most powerful monarch in Western Europe, was pulled from his horse and taken prisoner. His armor was stripped off. He was led away in chains. It was an almost unbelievable outcome. Kings were rarely captured in battle. The last French king taken prisoner in war had been John II, captured by the English at Poitiers in 1356, nearly 2 centuries earlier. Francis wrote to his mother from captivity, "Of all things, nothing remains to me but honor and life, which is saved." Even that might have been optimistic. He was taken to Spain and imprisoned in Madrid, where Charles V kept him for over a year, negotiating the terms of his release. The Treaty of Madrid, signed in January 1526, was brutally harsh. Francis was forced to renounce all French claims to Italy, to surrender Burgundy to Charles, and to hand over his 2 eldest sons as hostages to guarantee his compliance. Francis signed. He was released. He returned to France. And then he immediately repudiated the treaty. He had signed under duress, he claimed, and oaths made under compulsion were not binding. The Pope agreed, or at least, the Pope was willing to say so since he was increasingly alarmed by Charles V's overwhelming power. The wars resumed. Pope Clement VII Giulio de' Medici, cousin of Pope Leo X now, became a central figure in the Italian tragedy. Clement was intelligent but indecisive, diplomatic but ineffective. He saw that Charles V's dominance threatened to reduce the papacy to a Spanish puppet. He joined an alliance with France, Venice, and other Italian states. The League of Cognac formed in 1526. The goal was to drive the Imperials from Italy and restore the balance of power. It was a reasonable strategy. It led to disaster. Charles V was furious. He denounced the Pope as a traitor to Christendom. He demanded that Clement break the alliance and submit to imperial authority. Clement refused, or rather, he wavered, as he always did, hoping to find a middle path that didn't exist. Charles's army in Italy, commanded by the Duke of Bourbon, a French nobleman who had defected to the imperial side, was unpaid and near mutiny. The imperial treasury was empty. Charles couldn't afford to pay his soldiers or to send them home. Bourbon decided to march on Rome. The army that approached Rome in May 1527 was not a normal military force. It was a horde of desperate, starving men who had been promised loot they had never received. It included Spanish veterans, German Landsknechts, many of them Lutheran, with particular hatred for the Pope, and Italian soldiers of fortune. They had not been paid for months. They had been promised that Rome would pay. Bourbon himself was killed in the initial assault, shot while leading a charge against the walls. His death removed the last restraint on the army. What followed was not a military operation. It was an orgy of destruction. The soldiers broke into the city and began to plunder. They killed everyone who resisted and many who didn't. They ransacked churches, stealing sacred vessels and vestments. They tortured citizens, burning their feet, suspending them by their arms, crushing their fingers to extract hidden wealth. The German Landsknechts were particularly savage. They mocked Catholic ceremonies, dressing up in cardinals' robes and holding mock elections for a new pope. They desecrated relics, scattered the bones of saints, smashed altars and images. Their Lutheran faith, combined with their fury at not being paid, made them especially eager to destroy everything associated with the Roman Church. Pope Clement VII escaped to Castel Sant'Angelo through a secret passage just as the Imperials were breaking into the Vatican. He watched from the fortress walls as Rome burned. The sack lasted for days, then weeks, then months. Even after the initial frenzy subsided, the occupation continued to devastate the city. Disease broke out among the soldiers and among the Roman population, weakened by famine and violence. The Tiber River, according to contemporary accounts, ran red with blood. By the time the imperial army finally withdrew in February 1528, Rome was a shell of itself. The population had collapsed, the buildings were gutted. The art treasures were stolen or destroyed. The cultural capital of the Renaissance had been broken. The sack of Rome shocked all of Europe. Even Charles V, who had set these events in motion, was horrified. He wore black for months, publicly mourning the destruction of the Holy City. He insisted, probably truthfully, that he had not ordered the sack, that it had been the action of an uncontrolled mob. But the horror had happened on his watch, carried out by his soldiers. The responsibility was ultimately his. The theological implications were enormous. Many saw the sack as a divine judgment punishment for the corruption of the Renaissance papacy, for the worldliness of the Italian church, for the sins of a degenerate civilization. Protestant polemicists used the sack as evidence that Rome had lost God's favor. Catholic thinkers struggled to explain how God could allow such a thing. The answers they developed emphasizing the need for reform, for purification, for a return to spiritual values would eventually feed into the Counter-Reformation. The artistic implications were also profound. The generation of artists who had created the high Renaissance Leonardo, Michelangelo, Raphael was already passing. Leonardo had died in 1519, Raphael in 1520. Michelangelo survived the sack, but his later work took on a darker, more tormented quality. The confident humanism of the early Renaissance, the belief that human beings could perfect themselves through art and learning, gave way to something more anxious. The Mannerist style that followed was characterized by distortion, complexity, and unease, an artistic reflection of a world that had lost its certainty. Pope Clement VII eventually came to terms with Charles V. He had no choice. The League of Cognac had failed. France was exhausted. The Italian states were prostrate. Imperial power dominated the peninsula. In 1530, Clement crowned Charles V as Holy Roman Emperor in Bologna, the last imperial coronation performed by a pope. It was a symbol of reconciliation, but also of submission. The pope who had defied Charles was now placing the crown on his head. Charles used his victory to reorganize Italy. He confirmed Spanish control over Naples and Sicily. He installed a reliable Sforza-duke in Milan, and when that duke died without heirs in 1535, Milan passed directly to Spanish control. He supported Medici rule in Florence, where a branch of the family had been installed as hereditary dukes. The independent Italian states that had flourished in the Renaissance were becoming Spanish satellites, but France was not finished. Francis I would fight 3 more wars with Charles V before his death in 1547. His son Henry II would continue the struggle for another 12 years. The later Italian wars are a blur of campaigns, sieges, and battles that achieved little. France and the Habsburgs fought over Milan, over Naples, over influence in the smaller Italian states. Armies marched and countermarched. Cities were sacked and rebuilt and sacked again. Alliances formed, collapsed, and reformed in different configurations. The combatants were increasingly exhausted. France was financially crippled by the endless wars. Spain, despite the wealth flowing from the Americas, was perpetually short of funds. The Holy Roman Empire was distracted by the Protestant Reformation, which was tearing Germany apart. The Italian states that were ostensibly at stake became increasingly irrelevant. They were pawns, not players. Their territories were bargaining chips in negotiations between the great powers. Their populations suffered the consequences of wars they had no ability to prevent. The turning point came in 1556 and 1557. In 1556, Charles V abdicated. Exhausted by decades of warfare, increasingly afflicted by gout and depression, he divided his inheritance. Spain, the Netherlands, and the Italian territories went to his son Philip II. The Holy Roman Empire went to his brother Ferdinand. Charles retired to a monastery in Spain, where he spent his final years in prayer and contemplation. He died in 1558. In 1557, both France and Spain went bankrupt. Their treasuries were empty. Their debts were unpayable. The financial machinery that had sustained decades of warfare simply broke down. Neither side could continue fighting. The Peace of Cato Cambrisis, signed in April 1559, ended the Italian Wars. The terms were clear: Spain won. France renounced all claims to Italian territory. The Spanish Habsburgs would control Naples, Sicily, Milan, and Sardinia. Spanish influence would dominate the rest of the peninsula, even the Papal States, even the theoretically independent republics of Venice and Genoa. France received minor territorial compensations elsewhere, but the dream of an Italian empire was dead. 3 French kings, Charles VIII, Louis XII, Francis I, had sacrificed blood and treasure for Italy. They had gained nothing. The peace was sealed with marriages. Philip II of Spain married Elizabeth of Valois, daughter of Henry II of France. It was supposed to inaugurate an era of Franco-Spanish cooperation. During the celebrations of the wedding, Henry II participated in a tournament. A splinter from a shattered lance pierced his eye and entered his brain. He died 10 days later. France descended into the wars of religion, a series of civil conflicts even more destructive than the Italian Wars. The great power that had fought for Italy for 65 years was now consumed by internal strife to project power abroad. Spain was ascendant. For the next century, it would be the dominant power in Europe. The Italian Wars killed hundreds of thousands of people. Precise numbers are impossible to calculate, but estimates suggest that military deaths alone numbered in the hundreds of thousands. Civilian deaths from famine, disease, and massacre were probably higher. Some Italian regions lost a quarter of their population. The economic damage was staggering. Cities that had been centers of commerce and industry were ruined. Trade networks were disrupted. Agricultural regions were devastated by marching armies that consumed everything in their path, but the greatest damage was political. Before 1494, Italy had been a collection of independent states, each pursuing its own interests, balancing against each other, creating a competitive environment that had produced the Renaissance. The Italian Wars ended that independence. After 1559, Italy was a Spanish satellite. The major states Naples, Milan, Sicily were directly ruled from Madrid. The smaller states Florence, Ferrara, Mantua were dominated by Spanish influence. Even Venice and the Papal States, technically independent, had to accommodate Spanish power. Italy would not be independent again until the 19th century. The peninsula that had led Europe in art, culture, and political innovation became a backwater ruled by foreign powers, economically stagnant, politically marginalized. The Garden of Europe had become a graveyard. What did 65 years of warfare actually accomplish? On the surface, the answer seems simple. Spain won, France lost, Italy was conquered. The political map was redrawn, the balance of power shifted. But the deeper consequences were far more profound. The Italian Wars didn't just change who ruled which territory. They transformed European civilization itself. They ended the Renaissance. They created modern warfare. They established the state system that would dominate Europe for centuries. They demonstrated, with terrible clarity, what happened when great powers competed for dominance without restraint. The graveyard that was Italy in 1559 was also the birthplace of the modern world. Let's start with warfare. The Italian Wars began with knights in shining armor and ended with professional armies of infantry, artillery, and firearms. The transformation was so complete that a soldier from 1494 would barely recognize the battlefield of 1559. In 1494, the French cavalry was still the decisive arm. Armored knights on heavy horses, charging with lances, expected to shatter enemy formations through sheer impact. Infantry was secondary pikemen and crossbowmen who supported the cavalry but didn't win battles on their own. By 1559, the cavalry charge was obsolete. The key developments were firearms and field fortifications. The arquebus, a primitive musket fired from a shoulder rest, was inaccurate and slow to reload. But when hundreds of arquebusiers fired together, they created a storm of lead that no cavalry charge could survive. The Spanish tercios perfected the combination. Pikemen formed the core of the formation, their long spears creating a hedge that cavalry couldn't penetrate. Arquebusiers stood at the corners and edges, pouring fire into any enemy who approached. The tercio was a mobile fortress, bristling with pikes and guns, capable of both offense and defense. The French, who had begun the wars with the best cavalry in Europe, were forced to adapt or die. By the mid-16th century, French armies looked increasingly like Spanish armies' infantry, heavy, firearm dependent, built around professional soldiers rather than feudal levies. Artillery evolved just as dramatically. The French bronze cannons of 1494 had been revolutionary, but they were still primarily siege weapons useful for knocking down walls, less useful in field battles. By 1559, lighter field guns could be moved with armies and deployed on battlefields, adding another layer of firepower. The old fortifications' tall stone walls with towers at intervals became death traps. Cannon could batter them down in days. New fortification designs emerged. Lower, thicker walls with angular bastions that eliminated dead zones and allowed defenders to cover every approach with crossfire. The Tres Italiens, as this new style was called, transformed siege warfare and urban planning across Europe. War became more expensive, more professional, and more deadly. The amateur armies of feudal lords gave way to standing forces of trained soldiers who made war their career. States that couldn't afford these new armies fell behind. States that could afford them became great powers. The Italian Wars also demonstrated something crucial about international relations. The balance of power mattered more than anything else. Before 1494, the Italian states had maintained their independence through a careful equilibrium. No single state was allowed to become too powerful. Alliances formed and reformed to check any rising threat. Diplomacy prevented conflicts from spiraling out of control. This system worked as long as the players were relatively equal in strength. It collapsed the moment a truly superior power entered the game. France in 1494 was simply too strong for the Italian states to resist individually. Their only hope was collective action alliances that pooled their resources against the invader. But collective action required trust, coordination, and a willingness to subordinate individual interests to common goals. The Italian states couldn't manage it. They were too suspicious of each other, too focused on their own immediate advantages, too willing to make separate deals with the invaders. Ludovico Sforza invited the French in, hoping to use them against his Italian rivals. The papacy switched sides repeatedly, trying to play France and Spain against each other. Venice looked out for Venetian interests, Florence for Florentine interests, and Italy as a whole was left defenseless. The great powers learned from this. Over the following centuries, European diplomacy would be dominated by balance of power thinking, the idea that no single state should be allowed to achieve hegemony, that coalitions should form automatically to check any rising power. This principle would shape European politics until the 20th century. It would prevent any power from achieving the kind of dominance that Spain briefly held after 1559. It would also ensure that European history was a continuous series of wars, as powers rose and were checked and rose again. The Italian Wars taught Europe that power politics was a permanent condition, not a temporary emergency. The cultural consequences were equally profound. The Renaissance was born in Italy. The artistic, intellectual, and cultural flowering that began in Florence in the 14th century and spread across the peninsula in the 15th had made Italy the center of European civilization. The Italian Wars killed the Renaissance, not immediately and not completely. Michelangelo continued to work until 1564. Venetian painting flourished through the mid-16th century. But the confident, optimistic humanism that had characterized the High Renaissance gave way to something darker. The sack of Rome in 1527 was the symbolic turning point. The city that had been the capital of Renaissance culture was destroyed by barbarian soldiers, not ancient barbarians like the Visigoths, but contemporary barbarians in the service of the most Catholic emperor. The trauma shattered Italian self-confidence. The belief that Italy was the pinnacle of civilization, that Italian culture was superior to the barbarism of the northern peoples, became impossible to maintain when those northern peoples were occupying Italian cities and massacring Italian citizens. The artistic style that emerged after 1527 mannerism reflected this disillusionment. Where High Renaissance art had been harmonious, balanced, and serene, Mannerist art was distorted, anxious, and strange. Figures were elongated, proportions were exaggerated, compositions were deliberately unbalanced. The art expressed a world that had lost its center. The intellectual climate shifted too. The optimistic humanism of Pico della Mirandola, the belief that human beings could perfect themselves through reason and learning, gave way to more pessimistic views. Machiavelli, writing in the aftermath of the French invasion, described politics as an amoral struggle for power, where virtue was irrelevant and only success mattered. It is better to be feared than loved, Machiavelli wrote in The Prince, if one cannot be both. This was not the philosophy of the confident Renaissance. It was the philosophy of a traumatized civilization trying to understand how everything had gone wrong. The religious consequences were also significant. The sack of Rome occurred just 10 years after Martin Luther had posted his 95 Theses, launching the Protestant Reformation. The two events were not directly connected, but they reinforced each other in profound ways. For Protestants, the sack was divine judgment. God had punished the corrupt Roman Church, the worldly popes, the decadent Italian clergy. The destruction of Rome by the soldiers of the Catholic emperor was proof that Catholicism had lost God's favor. For Catholics, the sack was a call to reform. The Church had to purify itself, to address the abuses that had provoked Protestant criticism, to become worthy of divine protection again. The Counter-Reformation that emerged in the mid-16th century was partly a response to the Italian Wars. The Council of Trent, which met intermittently from 1545 to 1563, reformed Catholic doctrine and practice. The new religious orders, especially the Jesuits, founded in 1540, combined spiritual discipline with militant activism. This reinvigorated Catholicism was more austere, more disciplined, and more aggressive than the Renaissance Church had been. The worldly popes who had patronized Michelangelo and Raphael gave way to reforming popes who cared more about doctrine than art. The religious map of Europe was being redrawn at the same time as the political map. The Protestant North Germany, Scandinavia, eventually England separated from the Catholic South. The fault lines created by the Reformation would generate centuries of religious warfare. And Italy, which had been the spiritual center of Christendom, became a battleground in the struggle between Protestant and Catholic, another arena where great powers competed for dominance. What happened to Italy after 1559? The short answer is, not much. For the next 3 centuries, Italy was a political backwater. The Spanish Habsburgs ruled the south and dominated the rest. The Italian states that retained nominal independence, Venice, the Papal States, the various duchies, were too weak to pursue independent foreign policies. The economic dynamism that had made Italian cities the richest in Europe faded. Trade shifted to the Atlantic powers Spain, Portugal, the Netherlands, England as the discovery of the New World, and the new oceanic trade routes marginalized the Mediterranean. The Italian banking houses that had financed European commerce were eclipsed by northern rivals. Population stagnated. The wars had killed hundreds of thousands. The plagues that followed the wars killed more. Some regions didn't recover their pre-war population levels until the 18th century. Cultural production continued, but Italy was no longer the undisputed leader. The artistic center of gravity shifted northward to Flanders, to the Netherlands, eventually to France. Italian artists still produced great work, but they were no longer setting the agenda for European culture. The political fragmentation that had characterized medieval and Renaissance Italy continued, but now it was a source of weakness rather than creative competition. Italy wouldn't be unified until 1861, 3 centuries after the Peace of Cato Cambrisis. For most of those 3 centuries, Italy was just a geographical expression, as Metternich would later say. It was a collection of territories ruled by foreigners, a former great power reduced to irrelevance. Who was responsible for this catastrophe? The easy answer is to blame the Italian states themselves. They invited the French in. They couldn't unite against the invaders. They made separate deals with foreign powers, sacrificing collective security for individual advantage. This is partly true. The Italian states did fail to cooperate effectively. Their mutual suspicions and rivalries made them easy prey. But the blame also lies with the great powers France, Spain, the empire who treated Italy as a prize to be fought over rather than a collection of sovereign states to be respected. They invaded without provocation. They violated treaties whenever convenient. They used Italian territory as a battlefield while claiming to be Italy's protectors. And the blame lies with the international system itself, or rather, with the absence of any international system. There was no mechanism for resolving disputes peacefully, no framework of international law that constrained state behavior, no institution that could enforce agreements. The Italian wars were a glimpse of what European politics would look like for centuries, an anarchic competition among great powers, restrained only by the balance of power and the exhaustion of the combatants. The Peace of Cato Cambrisis established a framework that lasted, with modifications, until the French Revolution. Spain was dominant but not hegemonic. France was checked but not destroyed. The Italian states were subordinated but not abolished. A rough balance prevailed. This balance was maintained through almost continuous warfare. The 16th and 17th centuries saw one conflict after another. The French Wars of Religion, the Dutch Revolt, the 30 Years' War, the Wars of Louis XIV. Each war was followed by a peace that adjusted the balance until the next war adjusted it again. The Italian wars established the pattern. Great powers would fight over strategic territories. They would form and reform alliances. They would exhaust themselves and make peace. And then, after a period of recovery, they would fight again. This was not a system designed to prevent war. It was a system designed to prevent any single power from winning. War was the mechanism by which the balance was maintained. The human cost was enormous. But the alternative, a single power dominating all of Europe, was considered even worse. Better endless war than universal empire. There's one more dimension of the Italian wars worth considering: what they revealed about the nature of power itself. The Italian states had been sophisticated, cultured, and wealthy. They had developed advanced techniques of diplomacy. They had patronized the greatest artists in history. They had believed with some justification that they represented the pinnacle of human civilization. And none of it mattered. When the French armies crossed the Alps, Italian sophistication was useless. When the Spanish tercios deployed their pikes and arquebuses, Italian culture provided no defense. When Rome was sacked, all the paintings and sculptures and libraries couldn't stop the killing. Power, in the end, came from armies. States that could field effective military forces survived. States that couldn't were conquered or marginalized. Everything else, art, philosophy, banking, diplomacy, was secondary. This was a harsh lesson, but the European states learned it thoroughly. The centuries after the Italian wars saw an arms race across the continent. States invested heavily in military technology, in professional armies, in fortifications and navies. The competitive pressure was relentless. This military competition had unexpected consequences. It drove innovation as states searched for any advantage over their rivals. It encouraged state building as governments developed bureaucracies to extract resources for war. It eventually contributed to European expansion as the military techniques developed in European wars were deployed against non-European peoples who couldn't match them. Let me return to where we started, the sack of Rome. In May 1527, the soldiers of the Holy Roman Emperor destroyed the city that had been the heart of Western civilization for 2,000 years. They killed thousands of people. They desecrated churches. They turned the Vatican into a barracks and the Sistine Chapel into a stable. Pope Clement VII watched from Castel Sant'Angelo as his city burned. He was a prisoner in his own capital, unable to protect his flock, unable even to escape. It was a scene that seemed to represent the end of everything, the end of Italian independence, the end of the Renaissance, perhaps the end of civilization itself. The trauma of the Italian wars forced Europeans to think more seriously about international relations, about the limits of power, about the conditions for peace. The thinkers who emerged from this period, Machiavelli, Guicciardini, Vittoria, Gentili, laid the foundations for modern political thought and international law. The military revolution that the Italian wars accelerated transformed European society, creating the powerful states that would eventually dominate the globe. The cultural shifts that followed the Renaissance produced the Baroque, the Enlightenment, and ultimately modern culture. Out of the graveyard, new life emerged. The Italian wars are not as famous as some other conflicts in history. They don't have the narrative simplicity of a war with clear heroes and villains. They don't have the ideological clarity of a war fought for a cause. They were, in many ways, pointless, a 65-year struggle that achieved little except destruction. France spent 3 generations trying to conquer Italy and failed completely. Spain spent 3 generations defending its Italian possessions and exhausted itself in the process. Italy itself was the victim, fought over by powers that cared nothing for its welfare. But the pointlessness is part of the point. The Italian wars showed what happens when great powers compete without restraint. They showed how quickly civilization can be destroyed. They showed that military power matters more than culture, that wealth without strength is just an invitation for conquest. These are uncomfortable lessons. We prefer to believe that virtue is rewarded, that culture and learning provide protection, that the arc of history bends toward justice. The Italian wars suggest otherwise. They suggest that history is shaped by power, by who has it and who doesn't, by who is willing to use it and who isn't. This doesn't mean that culture and learning and virtue are worthless. It means that they are not sufficient. A civilization that cannot defend itself will not survive, no matter how magnificent its art or how sophisticated its philosophy. The Garden of Europe became a graveyard. The cities that had produced Leonardo and Michelangelo and Raphael were conquered by foreign armies. The republics that had pioneered modern diplomacy were reduced to satellites. The banking houses that had financed European commerce were marginalized. The intellectual traditions that had questioned medieval assumptions were overshadowed by religious conflict. Italy would eventually recover. The Renaissance would be remembered as one of the high points of human achievement. The Italian people would eventually build a unified nation and take their place among the powers of Europe. But that was centuries in the future. For the generations who lived through the Italian wars, for the citizens who saw their cities sacked, for the artists who watched their patrons destroyed, for the thinkers who tried to make sense of the catastrophe, the immediate reality was loss. They had seen something precious destroyed. They had learned that history has no mercy for the weak. And perhaps that is the final lesson of the Italian wars, that everything we build is fragile, that civilization requires constant defense, that the gardens we create can always become graveyards. The great powers turned Italy into a killing field. They fought for 65 years over territory that none of them could hold permanently. They killed hundreds of thousands of people for advantages that proved fleeting. And in the end, the war exhausted itself. The combatants made peace because they couldn't afford to keep fighting. The killing stopped, not because anyone had won, but because everyone was too tired to continue. That's how most wars end, not with triumph, but with exhaustion. The Italian wars remind us of this uncomfortable truth. They remind us that power politics is eternal, that great powers will always compete, that the weak will always suffer the consequences. But they also remind us that even the worst conflicts eventually end. The gardens can be replanted, the civilization can be rebuilt. The graveyard doesn't have to be permanent. Italy survived the Italian wars. It took centuries, but eventually it recovered. Perhaps that's the most important lesson of all. Survival is possible. Even after catastrophe, the garden can grow again. But it will never be quite the same.